Hey everyone, back again with socialist feminism this time. Socialist feminism is going to be a bit significantly different from radical feminism. Um, Nowadays, we hear the words radical and socialist used right next to each other so often that it's easy to, I don't know, not distinguish between the two of them. But in real life, those two terms are not synonymous. And radical feminism is going to be pretty different than socialist feminism is going to be here. So, socialist feminism, to begin with, is a theory of structural oppression. So, radical feminism was just about men dominating women. Structural oppression theory answers the question, where are the women? With yes, they are being oppressed, but they are being oppressed because of the way society is set up structurally. They are ending up in situations of oppression. It's not exactly just men hammering away at them. And also, depending on where you are in the structure, you may be oppressed differently. So here is where we are going to be going in the direction of with socialist feminism. You have um, you have gender oppression, women being oppressed by men, but you also have a social class dynamic. So how does oppression work differently if a woman is middle class as compared to working class or upper class? And how does oppression work because men are being oppressed on the class system as well? So how complex is the dynamic between like a rich woman and the real oppression that she feels living in a patriarchy, and a working class man and the real oppression he feels because he is being exploited by his employer? So it's complicated. Structural oppression is complicated. Where we are going to go here is basically socialist feminism is going to start with Marxism, which makes some sense. But they're going to say, okay, so Marx talked about workers. And he didn't say this, but I mean, there's sort of the if I say to you, think about Marx's workers, men are what you're going to be thinking of, and the socialist feminists come along and say, look, women are working too, so we need to, as we've talked about this entire week, we need to talk about how you don't have generic people, you have men and you have women. That's the starting point. So socialist feminists are going to analyze society from women's experience, and it's an experience of capitalism and patriarchy. Whereas Marx obviously wasn't dealing with patriarchy because he's dealing with the generic worker and he's thinking in terms of men. Socialist feminists are thinking about women who are exploited by capitalism, but they are also oppressed by patriarchy. So this is very much taking a women's standpoint. So what they are going to do is they're going to move beyond Marxism in three important ways. Dealing with the material, we're going to redefine the material conditions of life. We're going to bring about the role of ideas. Max Weber, remember, did this a little bit for Marx, but the socialist feminists are going to do it in terms of thinking through patriarchy. And then more complex inequality. I've already alluded to that, but I'll get even more complex. So to begin with, this idea of the material conditions of life. So Marx obviously talked about the fact that you need food to eat, so being exploited, you are going to have a different experience by not having enough food, not having a decent place to live, that type of thing. But it was all in terms of economic dynamics. And the socialist feminists say, okay, but it's not, it's not, women face questions beyond just, are you being exploited and is your work alienating? Because there is a whole set of oppressions that happen away from work. Those things are true, but what if you do have enough, but you're expected to do all of the housework at home? Well, that's a different experience of society than Marx's male worker. What if your work isn't alienating, but what if you're sexual relationship with your spouse is really alienating. Um, that's a different experience as well. To be, to have this part of you that is as natural and intrinsic to us as this self-actualization through labor, our sexuality, and for it to be commodified in the way that women's sexuality is in our society, and to be married to somebody or in a relationship with somebody who isn't who is expecting your sexuality to be on his terms. That's a different way of experiencing alienation. And also, Marx said that capitalism also breaks human relationships apart. We did that with the commodity fetishism, but also the fact that when you're at work, you're not connected with your coworkers. Well, so what if you are supposed to be really connected with this person who's your spouse, but the relationship is not an equally emotionally intimate one? Well, that's another, again, in the same category as what Marx is talking about. But when we view it from women's experience, it's a whole different dynamic that people are experiencing, but that's real. Socialist feminism, you can tell I'm kind of excited about it. It's really doing what we talked about in the I believe it was the first video of this week, where we talked about the fact that viewing society from the perspective of the sort of oppressed majority is going to reveal a lot about the way society works. So that's what I mean by redefining the material conditions of life. Home maintenance is a material condition of life. Sex is a material condition of life. Emotional connectedness is a material condition of life. These are things that Marx didn't focus on, but that they are real, and they are about exploitation, and they are about alienation, or at least in a patriarchy for women, they certainly are. Boom, so that's one. Second, the role of ideas. This is kind of obvious. Marx talks about historical materialism. So it's about the way our actions lead to, or are the things that we're going to analyze in terms of making a difference in people's life. And Weber comes along and says, look, it's not just material conditions. You can have ideas like the Protestant ethic that changes the world as well. Well, for socialist feminists, Marx, you've done a nice job in terms of the materialism of dealing with capitalism, but patriarchy is also about ideas, right? It's about ideas of what's appropriate for men and for women, what is expected of a woman by a man in a relationship. These ideas play an important role in the way, in the experience of society for both men and women. And third, a more complex inequality. So I alluded to this, or I discussed it a little bit at the beginning, talking about how a woman's experience, a wealthy woman's experience might compare to a poor man's experience. Both are oppressed, but because we've introduced a gender dynamic, not just a class dynamic, it adds a degree of complexity. But it's also true that this idea of more complex inequality, even if we just look at that one woman. So she has inequality in terms of class, but she also has inequality in terms of gender. But even that, it's not, that gender situation is not simple, because we talked about emotionality, we talked about sexuality, we talked about labor at home, a whole bunch of dimensions of inequality that all of them are valid, right? Like if my relationship with my wife is completely egalitarian, except she is doing all of the housework, that's real. Even if she makes more money than I do, even if our sexual relationship is completely egalitarian, even if emotionally I'm completely there for her, if I never do the dishes, that's a material inequality in her life. So again, more complex inequality. Um, that's it for socialist feminism. Um, but you can kind of see that this is going to be a gateway for us into even more complex inequality, because socialist feminism basically is dealing with two dimensions. It's dealing with class and it's dealing with gender. And you can easily see where this is going to go. We can also talk about race, and we can also talk about age, and we can also talk about religion. And that idea is what we call intersectionality. I can't remember if it's called intersectional feminism right now. Intersectionality theory. That's going to be our last of our specific feminist theories. So I will talk to you about that in the next video.